Hello there and welcome to today's art class. So I'm Jeanne Cotter and this is Delicious Art online art classes. And today we're going to be painting this lovely picture of a beach. So if you've got this video or you're attending my class, then you should have this little printout which will have two images on it. You've got a black and white one and a colour version. You may have also received a JPEG image that you could pop up onto a screen or an iPad or something close by. So that's our subject for today. And I've just had a week away in the beautiful Whitsundays, and it was just glorious. This is not actually from the Whitsundays, it's Agnes Waters. A friend of mine's just moved there and she's posting all these amazing photos, so I keep pinching them from her. And I thought that one would be quite lovely to do. So welcome. What we're going to do now is switch over to my other screen so that you can see what I'm doing on my paper, and then we'll get started. The first part of the class today will be a charcoal drawing. And so if you want to have your art diary set up or drawing paper, whatever it is you use to do a sketch on. And so this part of the class will be actually sketching first. And we're going to do a black and white version of this image, which is why, sorry, I'm trying to find this
Jeannie,
button on my iPad. Yes, lovely.
sorry, I just to mention, I don't know if the other girls had the same problem, but I couldn't open my bigger picture.
Oh,
I could open the one that we're printing, that we
yeah.
use to draw from, but not the actual JPEG one that you mentioned.
Oh, okay.
It just wouldn't allow me to open that one.
Oh, that's a bit strange. Did anyone else have that problem?
No, I didn't.
You didn't? Okay.
Leslie shaking her head, yes.
Yeah. Okay, so maybe I need to have a look at that. Do you want me to try and resend that now?
No.
I just did a screenshot and then just saved it.
Yeah. I save it as a JPEG file in Photoshop, but sometimes it may not open as that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But I've got the picture to draw from, so that's absolutely fine.
Oh, good. Okay, lovely. All right, now let me just zoom in here. And there we go. So that's a view of my table. So you can see what I'm drawing. Oh, it's all gone slow now because my hands aren't there right now. So I'm having a little bit of a time lapse thing going on. All right. So the first part of the class is just to get us into practice mode, to get familiar with the picture and to study it a little bit, I guess, and just have a look at where everything sits within the image. And if you have a look at the picture or your notes there, you'll see that there's a little grid. I've popped a grid onto the colour version. So what that does is it breaks the picture into segments, so we can actually look at it into four parts. And that way, what I like to do is just focus on each segment one at a time, and it helps you get all your angles and all your lines and all your bits and pieces in the right spot. And it just means that you're focusing on a smaller section rather than trying to see the whole thing and draw it all at once. So let's grab a piece of charcoal. I'm just going to use a long thin stick of charcoal for this section because I just want to draw with it at this point as you would with a pencil. So I don't want a short chunky bit. I'll have a longer, thinner one. And what we do is we just draw what we call a thumbnail, or just a very loose kind of shape in the proportions of the drawing. So for instance, this one today we're doing is a landscape. So that means it's wider across the top and narrower on the sides. That's the shape of the paper or the picture that we're going to do. Sometimes you might be trying to put, a portrait picture into a landscape shape. And I know that sounds a bit silly, but it's really easy to do. And then things don't seem to work because of all the proportions and everything's out of whack. So the first thing to be aware of is the way that the picture lies, whether it's portrait, landscape, or square, or round, or whatever that is. But know that that's really important for getting all your proportions right. Once you've got your shape drawn in, and it may not be exactly the same size as what your picture is. If you want to measure it and make sure it is, then that's absolutely fine too. I like to start off fairly loose at this point and just not get too caught up in being terribly exact, which sometimes comes back to bite me on the bum. But it's a good process just to relax into your art and to, kind of get in the mood without getting too caught up with being precise. So what I've done there is drawn on my little grid marks, and that's now divided my picture into 4 parts. So what I can do now is look at each section. So if you want to look at the top left-hand section first, and just look at the outline of the trees against the sky and draw in that shape. So noticing around about where it starts on your grid line. So I would say on my picture, it starts at about a third of the way up inside this 1/4 segment here. So that would be about where that tree line begins on this grid mark. And then I'm going to draw it up, and I'm just going to do soft, wiggly sort of lines, because all these tree lines are quite soft. They're not a hard line. We've got leaves and loose pieces and things that make up the outline of that shape. So if you just do a soft, wiggly line like that, then that will be enough to just indicate the outline of the shape of the trees. If you notice, there's just a few little branches up here on the top left as well. So that might be a tree that's further forward that we can't see all of, but you can see a few little of the branches just running across through there. So you can just put a few little loose lines in there to represent that. At this stage, we're not doing a whole lot of detail. We're just looking at the main lines and the angles and things that are in this drawing. Because what's important about doing this kind of picture is to get your perspective and everything right. So what we need to do is, and I had to actually adjust this picture because the horizon line was a little bit crooked. So what I did was adjust it so that it made it straight, so that when we look at the horizon line of the water, it's flat and straight. But we'll remain in this little area first. So let's draw the line. Can you see the line between the bank of trees, so the earth where all the trees are growing from, and where the sand begins? And it runs almost straight across, but not quite. So I'd say it starts about 1/4 of the way up inside that center grid line, and then it comes across round about the same height, so it's nearly straight across there. So if we draw that line in there, then that gives us a definition between where the sand begins and where this little hill with all the trees and the scrub begins. So we're just doing lines at the moment. Don't worry too much about getting any shadows or depth or detail in there. All right, now we'll move over onto the right-hand top corner, and we're going to do the same thing in that section. Sometimes it's easier to cover up all the other quarters so you can't get too distracted. But if you want to just focus on that top right-hand corner, and again, noticing how high up inside that quarter, let's go onto the right-hand edge, how high up does the water begin? And I'd say it's about 1/4. So if that's a half, about 1/4 there. And then that runs all the way across, just about to where that sand line is on our other quarter. So that's our lovely straight horizon line running across there. So you can draw that in and make sure that's nice and horizontal. It's important, I think, to have your horizon line straight. Otherwise, paintings look like that, you might be, I don't know, taking it crooked or sitting on a boat and something's a bit wonky. So it's nice if your horizon line can be nice and straight across there. And then we've got to continue the rest of that, the trees and things that are coming from that left-hand side. And they come over into about 1/3 of the way into this quarter here. So they stop about there. And I'm just measuring all of this by eye. So, that's a half, that's 1/4. So that's about 1/3 by eye. If you want to measure it with a ruler and be precise, that's fine too. And then we'll just draw a line in over the top of those hills or the little headland that sits up there. Okay, so draw that across through there, and then that will finish off that section there. And then we've got to look at the water lines. So if you have a look at where the waves are coming in onto the sand, just in this little quarter here, so we're still in the top right-hand quarter, and what we want to do is get some of those shapes in through there. So if you draw a couple of lines like that through there and down that way. Just going to see, someone's got their microphone on. There we go. All good now. Could hear someone's hubby in the background, or a radio or something. All right. So next we're going to continue that line. So can you see the white line of the foam as it's coming across the water? So we're going to move down now into that right-hand quarter on the bottom, and I can see the line of the wave. Basically, it crosses over about a third of the way down on the halfway mark that's crossing across the picture. And I'm just going to continue that down into this top right-hand, bottom right-hand quarter. So that's that white foam wave that's going on just there. And I think that's the shape that I can see of that. So I've just drawn that in down into that bottom right quarter. And there's another couple of lines in there that we need to take note of as well. So just back up into the top right quarter, see the watermark. So on the sand, you can see where it's wet. So the wave's been there and it's wet the sand, and then the wave's gone back into the ocean again. So where the sand is all wet, it's quite that lovely, beautiful purpley blue color. And we want to get that shape in there as well. So that shape, if I go back up into this top right quarter, kind of comes down almost to that middle point. So you can see the middle point, the crosshairs there on the grid. And then it goes over into the other quarter. So if you want to wander across into that one now and continue that shape down, note how low down inside the bottom quarter or half that runs, and bring it across into here. So that's just bringing that across into the right-hand quarter, and that's giving us a little outline of that wet sand area. Okay, so this is just all to really just to get clear on the picture and how it's constructed, so that we can build it again when we start with the pastels. Okay, so now I'm looking at this other wave shape that's in the bottom right-hand quarter. So you can see here we've got this lovely foam that comes out from about just above halfway, I would say. So if that's my halfway point, it comes out about here. And just follow the shape of that as it comes down and across. And it crosses over that line and ends over here. So we've got to look at the shape of that. So it comes across and back in and down a little bit and then out. There we go. So pulling that across, ducking into the right, and then taking that across the bottom of the page, a little dip there to get those shapes right, and then over into the left-hand bottom quarter and off the page. And that's quite got a strong shadow there. So when you look at the shadows in this picture, it gives you an indication of where the light's coming from. So looking at that shadow on that bottom wave there is telling me that the light must be coming from behind us, or above, behind and right, I would say. So coming from kind of this direction. Because what's happening is this white wave is casting a shadow or a dark area onto the sand here. So the light's hitting the top of the wave. That's why it's so bright and white on that area there. So the light's got to be coming from behind us, say behind our right shoulder as we look at this picture. So maybe it's sunrise or early in the morning, and the light's just bouncing off that water beautifully. Okay, so now we've got most of that drawn in. you've kind of got a bit of an idea of the main shapes of the lines that we need to focus on. And then the next part, just before we move on to the colour, is to just do a little bit of tone work. So if you now refer back to your black and white version, you'll be able to see that there's quite a lot of mid-grey in there. So most of this is fairly mid-grey. You'll see your sky is lighter. So you've got a fair bit of very pale grey in the sky. And then the trees and scrubby stuff there and the headland are darker in tone. So what I'm looking at is tone here. We're studying the tones. So if we had to do this in one colour, like charcoal, for instance, then you would just vary the tones and you would change, you know, how dark or how light your greys are. And then use black as your darkest, and then of course white as your lightest. So that's what we're kind of doing with the tones. And we want to really study that so that we get quite clear on what the lights and the darks are. So if you grab a short piece of charcoal, oops, sorry, I'm trying to refocus this on my little screen so that it's easier to see. There we go, that's better. Just makes it a bit bigger. So if you grab a shorter piece of charcoal, so something about that size, or even smaller if you have something. I find fatter ones are easier to hold if I'm using them on the side, because what we want to do is shade in some areas. And you'll get a much softer mark if you use a shorter, wider piece of charcoal. So what I'm going to do is very lightly shade in. See, the top of the sky is slightly darker than the other part. So the bottom of the sky, where it meets the horizon, is actually really light. But as it goes up into the top of the sky or the top of your picture, it gets slightly darker. So that's a good thing to note for when we're going to do the sky, because then we'll need a couple of blues. We'll need a darker blue, not really dark, but slightly darker than what will be on the horizon, which will be almost white or very light blue. Okay, so if you put a little bit of charcoal in there, just rub it in with your fingers, and that will give you that very gentle gradient from darkish down to the very light. And in the light area, we don't need to put any charcoal at all. We can just rely on the white to be the light. Then we want to just darken up some of this tree area. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail here. Just keep your marks a little loose. You can use the tip of your charcoal. You can use the side of it to get that furry kind of effect. The tip of the charcoal will give you smaller marks and help to give you, you know, a few of those little loose branches or leaves or whatever they look like there. And then all that earth or dirt is a little bit more grey than some of the sand, for instance. And then I might just mark in this bit of tree branch on the top left as well, again. So see how just by using different tones and pressing harder for the dark areas and lighter for the lighter bits, you're just creating this really nice grade or graduation of tone with dark and light. And you can see in the earth there where the trees are growing out, there's a few bits of darker shapes. So that's just shadow of the earth where there might be some dips or turrets or something like that where the trees are growing from. So you can just darken off a couple of those spots and that will give you those little bits of shadow and shade. Now let's look at the water. So the water is kind of not as dark as the trees, but it's definitely darker than the sky. So now's the time to sort of start looking at that and filling some of the water in as well. So this is the water that's back on the horizon. It's got quite a dark tone to it. And again, you can pop a bit of charcoal down on there once you've rubbed that in with your short piece, and then blend it in with your fingers just to soften that off a little bit. Now I know there's some white in there. To get my white back into there, because I've put my charcoal into most of this area, I can use an eraser to take it out so that the white of the paper will show through, and that will become the white of the waves. Okay. Now let's look at the sand and the colour of the wet sand in comparison to the dry sand. When you look at the black and white version, there's really not a whole lot of difference. They're very similar in tone. We do have a darker tone around the edge of where it's wettest. So right on the edge here, it's a little darker. And then it gets a little bit lighter, and then it gets darker again as it comes back in closer to the water. So noticing that stuff is going to help you choose your colours, because your colours will have to be chosen based on the tone as well as whatever we can see in the picture. So what I've done is I've shaded, sort of softly shaded around the edge of that wet area there, that where the sand and the wet area meet. Then I've left the inner section unfilled, and I've popped a little bit of charcoal into the center area. So what I'm going to do now is just push that in again, soften that off, because that's the wet sand. And when we go to do that, we'll have to find some really nice purples and things to make that look nice and wet. It's amazing what colours are in sand when you start to look. I'm just putting a bit more shadow in through these waves here. So see where the waves are kind of taller, and the front side of the waves is in shadow, and then we've got the light sitting on the top. So I'm just putting a bit more shadow through there where those little waves come across into that wet sand area. Before I come any more further forward, I'm just going to tone off the sand as well. So again, if you look carefully, you can see that there's some little lighter tones on the left and around where the rocks or the trees are. And then as it comes out, it kind of graduates out into like a more of a mid-tone sort of sand, a mid-tone grey. And then in the foreground, it's all very mid-tone, isn't it? It's all very much same there. So again, you know, we'll have to find some colours that will work in that area there. And again, push that in with your fingers just to soften it off a bit. And then if you've, blurred off some of the other areas that you did before, you can just come back over that and mark that in again. So working in tone like this is quite detailed, because it really makes you take notice of, the dark and the light. And it's really good training to do that, because then you can figure out what colours will work for those tones. So this painting actually has a lot of mid-tone in it. There's quite a lot of mids, and there's not much dark, and there's only a little bit of light, but that's what will make it more dramatic, is the lightest lights. And then as we come forward down here, you get quite, well, as I said earlier, we've got that shadow under that foam that runs down here at the front. So that's actually quite dark. And then it's mostly white foam with just a little bit of mid-grey or dark grey dots and shapes through there. So you could just literally run your charcoal over that, use the end of it this time just to get smaller marks, smaller, harder marks. And that can start to look like, hopefully, some white foam. And if not, if you do want to get your white foam back into your waves, so you might have made it too grey in some areas, and that's what's lovely working with charcoal on white paper, is you can now use your kneadable eraser. So if you have one of those, grab that and grab a piece of it, and you can kind of knead it into a point or a blade kind of shape, and then you can use it to take off some of your charcoal and get the whites back in. So you kind of almost draw with that eraser to put those whites back in there. And you'll find as you keep using it, it'll pick up the charcoal on the edge, so you need to keep kneading it. That's what's called kneadable. You're going to knead it all the time to find a clean spot, basically. These rubbers will last for ages, so I tend to use them until they're filthy, absolutely black. And they're just wonderful because what they do is they pick up the pigment or they pick up the charcoal or the pastel or whatever's on your paper without taking the paper off, whereas most other erasers will remove the paper, kind of peels the paper off, and it can mark your paper. But these are great because they don't hurt the paper. They're literally just like a little sticky thing that picks up all the pigment for you. So that's how you can use the kneadable eraser. It's just to get some of that white back in there and to create that lovely effect of water and waves. So I won't carry on with this for much longer because I do want to get stuck into the pastel and the colour version of it. You could potentially spend a lot more time on this and really make it pretty amazing with your charcoal. And feel free to do that if you're inspired by it, because charcoal is a beautiful medium to work in. And, you don't always have to have colour. It's very good training, and it's very satisfying when you can get all those gorgeous tones going on. So you can see there I've taken quite a bit of my white, or put white back in, and then you can come back over it if you need to and just darken off again to get your tones back in there. So you can kind of work between the two until you've got everything where you need it to be. So let's get started on the colour version. And then if you feel like coming back to this one afterwards, by all means do, because as I said, it's heaps of fun. Heaps of fun to work with charcoal. So that's just a little part one of our class, and that's just a practice version, just to become familiar with your pictures and to get to know them. And then it's like a little rehearsal really, and then we get to do it in colour. And because we've done it once already, it just seems to make it so much easier because we've already got some familiarity with all the shapes and tones and things that we're thinking about in this one. Okay, so I'm going to pop my art diary away and think about what coloured pastel paper to use. So today I've chosen a blue one because there's blue in my picture, and I would have liked a terracotta actually, but I don't have any on hand, so that's why that didn't work out. And we'll just have to change the focus again so that I can fit this into my screen. Bear with me while I get that smaller. Just a few things. So this is a blue paper. It's more like a sea blue or greeny blue colour. It doesn't really matter what colour paper you use because we will fill the whole page in today with pastel. So, unless you have a paper that you want to use part of for your drawing. So for instance, if I had a dark blue paper, then maybe I could leave some of my seawater unpainted and let the paper show through and be part of my artwork. So that's the beauty of pastel papers and their colours, because you can actually do that, and you can leave a lot of it unpainted. So it just makes it a little bit more interesting sometimes to have that option to let the paper show through, which is kind of cool. All right. Straighten that up a little bit. Sorry, I'm still mucking around with the focus now, trying to get things right. Everything's lagging behind by a few seconds. All right. So that's my paper. The other thing you're going to need is a little board. So I'm just using a small board today, and what I do is I pop my paper onto my board. I've already got some tape here on the corners from last time, and it's a good idea to tape your paper down onto your board, because that way it's not going to move around you, and you've got two free hands rather than having to hold the paper still all the time. So I'll just get some new bits of tape for those corners because they're a bit worn out. You can reuse things over and over, and you can also tape around the edges. So if you want to, put tape all the way around your paper, you're welcome to do that. And if you're on an easel and upright, then that's often a better option, because then it won't fall, and you don't have to keep it still. Okay, so you can use either masking tape or this blue tape is called 14-day tape. I think it's what painters use when they're painting. So either of those is fine. Just when you do put tape on, if you put it all the way around or all the way across, just make sure you stick it onto your clothing or something first and get a little bit of the adhesive off, because it can tend to tear the paper sometimes, especially this outer border on the Colourfix paper. It's not been treated, so it's just raw paper, and it will tear sometimes if your tape's too sticky. So just try to make sure that you get a bit of that adhesive off first, so it's not too sticky. That's why I tend to use secondhand bits of tape, because I know it's not going to tear my paper. Okay, so now I've got that tape down onto my board, and I can then look at drawing this up again. So when I'm on a light coloured paper like this, I like to use charcoal to draw, because charcoal is really easy to take off. This paper is quite gritty, and when you press hard with a pastel or a pastel pencil, sometimes it's a bit more difficult to get it off if you want to remove it with your eraser. So using charcoal is a great idea because it's much softer. If I don't press too hard, I'll be able to take it off later on. And the first thing you want to do is rule up your page with your grid lines. If you're on dark paper, you might want to use a pastel pencil in a white or a light colour, just so that it's easy to see. And so it's good to have a few pastel pencils just for this drawing segment, because, as I said, different coloured papers, you'll need different coloured pencils to be able to see. But if you're on light or mid, try charcoal, because it really does come off nice and easily. So these grid marks, when I want to take those off afterwards, I'll be able to remove them without any trouble, because it's so soft. So I'm just drawing my grid line on here. That's the first thing we need to do, is get the grid line set up. So halfway across my page, this page is 23 by 30. So half of 23 is 11.5, and then half of 30 is 15. So if you just find those measurements and draw up your grid, then you'll be ready to go. And do exactly what we did last time. So we're just going to draw in all the main outlines of everything. Once we've got those in, then we can start putting some pastel on and apply some colour. So just referring again back to your notes with your picture. And we might start again where we did before. So we could start in this top left-hand quarter. Again, where does the tree line cross this mark? And it's about a third of the way up, I would say. Yep. This is just by eye. You can measure if you want to. And then I'm going to draw my line. I'm going to trace the outline of that up through there and then down and across. So that's going to be the tree line. So bringing it across, just follow the shape of what you can see in your picture. It doesn't have to be precise or too exact at this point. Trees are very natural, so we can just make those whatever shape you want to, really. Now, I'm not going to bother putting the trees up in the top left corner, because we're going to fill that up with sky anyway, so we'll leave that to later. What we do want to look at, though, is the line of land from here, so on the right-hand side of this grid and across, so that we get the nice line of where the sand meets the dunes or the hills where the grass and trees are. So that's that line across to there. I'd say it's nearly straight. I think it slopes down just a little tiny bit, but hardly anything. So it's not a lot. Okay, so once you've got that bit done, then hop over into this right-hand top grid, and we're going to look at where that little headland comes to. And it comes about 1/3 of the way across inside that grid. So if you draw that little line across through there, and also the straight line of the land and where that meets the headland, and then we can pop the horizon line in of the water. So the horizon line begins at about a quarter of the way up, or it's actually level with that. So I'd say about there, and you can pull that across like that. If you want to use a ruler, by all means do that, because it's good to get your horizon nice and straight. So I can use my ruler, put that straight down on there, and make sure I get a nice straight line. Like that. Good. The other shapes that we want to look at within this quarter is the water shapes. So remember we drew it. This is where all the waves are kind of coming onto the sand. So I've got to draw those little lines in there, which is kind of the outline of those waves. And then we can continue those down into this next quarter. So onto the bottom right-hand quarter across through like that, so that we get that nice continuous line of waves coming through. You see I'm holding my charcoal quite loosely, and that's because I try to keep my marks light and loose. If you hold your charcoal like you would a pencil or a pen, you tend to be a little bit too rigid and not relaxed, and your mark will be harder and more defined, which is good if you want to do fine work. So I just find if I hold it on the end between 2 or 3 fingers and sort of let it feel a little bit looser, it tends to relax me a bit more, and I don't get too caught up in getting everything exactly precise. So the main thing to do for now is just to get our shapes of everything onto the paper. Noticing the angles of everything too. So I'm going to pop this watermark in now. So that's where the sand is nice and wet, and we've got that beautiful shape. It's going to be fun putting the blues and purples into there. So why is it blue and purple? Because it's reflecting the colours around it. So if the sand's wet, it's going to reflect the sky, and that's why we get that beautiful shiny blue or light blue effect. And then while we're down in this bottom quarter, we can come across and put this other wave line in. So again, that starts at just above the halfway line. So a bit out there, I'll come down too low. If you do make a mistake, just grab your kneadable eraser and take your mark off. It should come off fairly easily if you've been pressing light. And then across through there, down through here, and then across into that bottom left-hand corner. So they're our main shapes that we want to get in for now. So just bringing that wave line across there, and basically we just want to make sure, check that you've got all your angles right, because when you're doing things like this in perspective, especially waves and beaches and things, we really need to make sure we've got all the angles right, because if you have your angle off a little bit, it won't look right. It'll look, like it's standing up or too tall or something like that. So it's important to make sure you get all those angles and things correct. All right, so now we've got our main picture done. Let's have a look at some pastel colours that we would use for this. Keep your charcoal nearby, because that sometimes comes in handy if you want to do a finer line and you need to have a darker colour. So I've picked out some colours for this one today, and I'm just going to pop them here on the screen so you can see what I've got. I like to lie them down on paper towel, because that way I can wipe them clean if I need to. You can see a few of them are a little bit dirty because they've been hanging around with their mates in my pastel tray. So So they do tend to get a bit grubby when they rub together. Sometimes it's hard to see what colour they are because they get so dirty. So paper towel is a good option because you can give it a little wipe and get them nice and clean again. Okay, so what I've selected here is a nice range of colours that I can see in the picture, but I've also tried to be very aware of making sure I've got my light tones, my mid-tones and my dark tones. So it's really important to make sure you get those darks and lights as well as all the mids, because as I said before, there's quite a lot of mid in this picture. So all our oranges and blues and greens and purples are quite mid-tones. So, and they're the foundation for the picture. And then we're going to need some darks to give it some shadow and depth. And then we're going to need the lights to show us where the light is, and you know, the sunshine and the highlights. So now I've got all of those there together. I'm going to wait a little while. I might go have a 10-minute break while everybody gathers their pastels and gets yourselves organised. So I'll leave this sitting here for you so you can see what colours I've picked out, and we will have a little break. All right, so we've had a little break, so now we're going to get stuck into putting some colour on the page. What I like to do when I'm doing this is to just fold my notes in half and then prop the picture up in front of me so I can actually see it easily from where I'm sitting. It's always good if you've got your reference photo close by, and then the less you've got to move your head. So try not to have to turn to look at your picture. If it's within eyesight, without having to move your head too much, then that'll just make life a whole lot easier for you. And it just means that you can glance at it all the time, because we actually spend a lot more time looking at the reference photo than we do the actual painting, in theory. I've also got my image on the screen. I know some of you said that you couldn't download that, and I'm sorry about that. I'll have to try and figure out a way to make that easier for you. But if you have got it on a screen or a phone or an iPad or something nearby, that's also good, because then you can zoom in and really see some detail. So let's get stuck into this. We're going to start with the sky, because that's the thing that's behind everything. So I always try to work from back to front or top to bottom, depending on what I'm painting. In this instance, it's top to bottom because it's a landscape. So I always find it easier to start from the sky and work my way down the page. That's also good if you're on an easel, because your dust drops down and often it'll catch on your paper. So if you work from the top and you get pastels, say blue pastel from the sky, kind of gripping onto your paper further down, you can rub it in later, so it doesn't become a major problem. Now, because our sky is a light colour, what I want to do is remove my charcoal from the sky area and rub that off with my kneadable eraser. So I can now take out my grid lines. If you're happy with where everything is in the picture, now's the time to take those out if they're going to interfere with your painting. If maybe you've used a light coloured pencil and you're happy about covering that up and you know that it's not going to interfere with your final colours, then you can just leave it in there. But sometimes it's easier to remove it, because then you don't get too confused about where things are. So just taking that off with my kneadable eraser. I'm not being terribly fussy about it. You can spend lots of time removing all of it, but I know that I'll be covering all of this up with pastel, so I just want to get the main mark off, I guess, so that I can have a nice clean page to start with. The other good thing to do, if you remember, is to mark the sides of your paper where those grid lines were, so I can still faintly see where they were. That way, if down the track, halfway through the painting, you think, oh, hang on, how far above my halfway line was the horizon or whatever, and even though your grid lines have gone, you've still got these little markers on the sides that you can refer back to find the grid lines again if you need to, if that makes sense. So it's good just to give yourself a little bit of a reference there. so that you can refer back to that afterwards if you're trying to remember where something goes or where it sits within the grid. So that's a good option. Okay, so let's look at this sky. The picture I've got here, so the printout, it's a lot whiter or paler than the one on the screen. So you can make your sky any colour you like, really, but I'm going to use two versions of blue for my sky. So I've got a darker blue for the top area, and it's a typical sky kind of colour. We will all have different pastels and different colours, so it's not going to look exactly the same as everyone's, and that's okay because that's what makes it yours. So I'm going to use this blue for the top of my sky. As I mentioned earlier, if you have a blue paper that you really like the colour of, you might want to leave that part unpainted and just put some lighter blue down on the horizon line there. Up to you. When I am filling in a wider area of something like a sky, I like to use my pastel on the side. So I lie it down on my paper or push it down on the paper and just use the side of it. That way you get a really nice wide coverage of colour. And I'm going to press fairly lightly and just, as I come down towards the water line, press less heavy so that I've got more pastel across the top where I want it to be a bit darker, and then less of that blue as I come down. But I'm still going to have to merge it with my lighter blue afterwards. So that's why I'm pulling a little bit of it further down beyond the middle mark so that I can blend that in later on with my lighter blue. So you can see now the pastel I'm putting on is leaving a few kind of little holes, and that's because the paper's textured. So when you're working on textured paper like this, what it does, it kind of grabs the pastel on the textured bits that are sticking up higher, and it leaves what looks like little holes or spaces in the lower parts. If you can hear puppies barking in the background, it's just two puppies playing in the backyard, so don't stress. We're puppy sitting today, so they're having a fun time out there. So you can see that the texture's showing through like that. But once I start to blend that in with my fingers, then it'll all kind of fill in. You might really like that look. It looks kind of cool because it's nearly like a cloudy sort of sky. So potentially you could leave that as it is and just work with that and keep it nice and loose. So everybody's got their own style with pastels and everybody likes to do it in a different way. I like both styles, but I have to admit I do like to blend. And so blending this in is what gives me joy, because then I can start to see the colours really fill up the tooth of the paper. So what you want to do is just pick a finger, any finger, and start to push the colour in. And remember to think about the shape of the thing that you're colouring in or filling in. So this is a nice wide blue sky. So what I'm doing is nice wide movements with my finger, and I'm pulling the pigment horizontally across my page so that it's starting to get that lovely wide kind of feeling. And as I come down where I've got less and less of this darker blue, then there'll be less to rub in. So I just want to kind of push it into the paper to make sure that it hangs on nicely. Now you might find you didn't get enough colour down on the first layer, and so you can quite happily then layer another, another sweep of colour over the top of that to get more pigment down on the paper. And you can see there's a lot of dust coming off from that. But pick up your pastel, wipe it across, get some more down on there, and then you can blend that in again. So you can actually blend quite a few layers on top of each other. What I'm trying to achieve is a beautiful smooth blue, just like the sky is so smooth. There's no obvious clouds in that sky. There might be some wispy ones far, far away, but to me it looks really clear and blue. And of course my blue is a little bit different to the blue in the picture, and that's okay too, because I actually prefer the brighter blue. So again, pulling your finger across horizontally, so you get those lovely big wide marks. And see how the top of the sky now is looking nice and rich and thick, and the papers are full of tooth, and it's got this lovely depth to it. And then as I come down, I want to go lighter. I want to get lighter down here on the horizon. So I'm going to use my very light blue. It looks nearly white. It's not white, it's just a pale blue. And I'm going to do the same thing with that, just across the bottom here on the horizon where the water is. And also across the top of that little headland. And so what I'm doing now is I'm just putting this lighter blue on the bottom, and then I'm slowly kind of pulling a little bit of it up towards the darker sky, because what I want to do is merge these two blues so that they kind of blend together really nicely and you can't see where they join. So we don't want a stripe. We don't want a blue stripe of dark blue and light blue. What we're aiming to do is to merge these two blues together so that we get this lovely gradual blend from dark down to light. Okay, so once you've got enough pastel on there, and we can add more, so don't stress if you feel like it's not enough yet, then you want to just give your finger a wipe. And what I've got next to me here is a little hand towel. One end is wet and the other is dry. So that means I can wipe my finger off on the wet section, get it reasonably clean, and then give it a dry so that it's dry and ready to go. So that means I can now put my fingers into the light blue, and I'm not going to put dark blue back in there, which I would have done if I hadn't cleaned my fingers because I was covered in dark blue. So I've got my finger here, and I can start now to pull that across in the same direction on the horizon line. And what that will do is kind of smudge the horizon line that you drew in. I'm also overlapping the top of my headland and my trees. The reason I'm doing that is I want to make sure that I get enough of this down behind the trees so that when we come forward to do the trees over the top, you'll be able to see some of the sky behind the trees, and there'll be this lovely continuous blend of sky. And I won't have to get in there and put sky in later. So I'm working from top to bottom, but I'm also thinking about what's behind and what's in front. So you can see here now, they're starting to merge together nicely. So I'm going to have to do some more gentle blending just to close the gap a little bit and get rid of that stripy kind of look, because it's still looking a little stripy. So to do that, I'm going to pick up my light blue again and wipe that over the darker blue just in the center area, and just very lightly sweep it across, because then I can get my fingers back into it and start to push that in and create this lovely gentle smooth gradation from light to dark. So once you've got some of that on there, then you can again come back in and start to pull that colour around and create that gradual blend from dark to light. And often you'll need to kind of move your finger from top to bottom. So what I'm doing is going sideways, so pulling my finger horizontally, and I'm kind of dragging the pigment up, the light pigment up into the dark, and then coming back down again from the top into the bottom to smooth out that beautiful combination from dark to light, and try and make those blend in so that there's no hard lines between the two colours. So just running my finger across, continuing to do that all the way across the sky. You can do it in big wide marks if you want to go the width of the page, or you can do it in segments. But the secret is keep your finger on the page as you wipe it across like this and pull that pigment down. So pull the dark down into the light, get down to the bottom where the light is, and then start pulling it back up into the dark. So we're getting that beautiful natural gradation. Makes your fingers hurt sometimes. So I can still see a bit of a stripy thing going on there. So what I'm going to do is pop a bit more of my darker blue. So I've got my pastel again. As you can see, you can add more layers. And I'm going to put a bit more pigment of dark across there. And then I want to put a bit more of my light pigment across here again. So see how I'm just adding more pastel to my paper, because what I want to do is get it nice and thick and rich. And to do that, you need to have plenty of pigment on your paper. so that it can kind of hang on to it and get lovely and thick. So I'm going to pull that down again and then start to run my finger across again, trying to close this gap between light and dark. Now you might like to leave it there. I mean, it looks all right actually. It looks like just a bank of clouds that might be sort of sitting on the horizon that are off in the distance and much lighter. Go this way for a second and see what happens. So see how when I pull that, I'm going up and down now. So see how when I do that, it changes the feeling of the sky, doesn't it? It's not wide and expansive anymore. It's kind of, because I've gone up and down and created this vertical blend, it's really changed the way that it feels. But I feel like it might help me to get those colours to kind of merge together. And then I'm going to run across horizontally again to sort of widen the sky and smooth it out a bit more. But this is quite a nice way to get the blues to kind of merge nicely together. Are your fingers hurting yet? Mine is. It's the only trouble when you're filling in a big area like this. So once you've got the horizontal marks in there and you feel like that's starting to blend quite nicely, give your fingers another wipe and then just start again from the top and run horizontal down like this. Change fingers if you're getting too sore. There we go. I think that might do for my sky. So you can definitely see the difference between the light and the dark, but I'm quite happy with how that's looking. So I'm going to leave that as is. You can see I've got a lot of dust on my page, so that's a lot of dust that kind of, it's excess dust from the pastel, and often it won't all blend in. So I'm just going to tip my board up and tip off the dust onto a little towel. It's always handy to have a little towel nearby, paper towel or something like that that you can tip all the dust onto. Try really hard not to blow it. As tempting as that is, you know, it's just easier if you kind of blow it all away, but it gets everywhere, so best not to do that if you can help yourself. Okay, so that's the sky section done. Now we're going to work on the next area that sits down a little tad lower, and that will be the headland and the trees. So sort of working down, and also the water line. We might put the water line in first actually. So if you have a darker blue, I picked out this really beautiful ultramarine kind of blue. I think that'll be lovely for my water, because to me it looks quite rich and green, and it's a much darker tone than the sky. So I'm just going to draw my line in there like that, and just go lightly, press lightly at first until you're sure, and then you can kind of fill in the rest like we did before with the pastel on its side, so you get a nice wide coverage to put the water in there. Keep it fairly light because we'll be coming back over this afterwards with more colours, possibly, you know, a bit more light and dark to make the waves and the reflections and things. We're just trying to get a base colour down on there for now. While I've got this blue in my hand, I'm kind of looking around the picture to see if it needs to go anywhere else. Is there somewhere else on this picture where there's the same kind of blue? I'm just going to pop a little bit of it down in here. Just in this bottom right hand corner, it's almost like there's a shadow of something there on the water. So it's always nice if you can put the same colour in a couple of places in a picture. I'm also going to pop it onto that little shadow that's just here in the foreground. Now I know the shadow is darker than that, and we will darken it off later, but I think the blue will be a nice kind of under colour for that. I'm just going to smush a little bit here on the wet sand too, just for fun, because as I said, that's a much lighter blue, and we can put that over afterwards. So I'm kind of blocking in some areas now just to get some of that blue down on the paper. Lovely. Once you've got enough on there and you're happy with that, then just push in the blue that you've got in that water area there. What we're trying to do now is just to get it to stick to the paper. You might find you get a fair bit of dust, and that'll depend on the brand of pastel you're using. Different colours behave differently too. You'll probably find when you're using yellows, they're much harder than blues. So everything's kind of a bit blurry at the moment. We're not doing anything too defined. We're just being a bit blurry and soft and getting some colour to stick to the paper. That's the main goal at this point, is just blocking it all in. It's best to work that way with pastels because you kind of push all the colours in and make big bold shapes, and then as you start to refine it and get more detail on the paper, that's when you start to you know, be more intricate, I guess, with your movements. But at the start it's good just to block all the colours in. So now we've got that blocked in. I've got dust on there, so I'm going to tip that off again. The good thing about tipping the dust off onto a towel or something is you can take it outside later on and shake it off. And then we can start to block in the other areas. So for instance, we've got all this tree and dirt area across here. So I'm going to use my terracotta colour, which is pretty much the same as my sand, just to block in a little bit of that. And that comes up fairly high, that hill, sand dune, or whatever that might be there. And then it peters out into the headland. So if I block that in with my orange colour, and then of course the sand is a similar colour, so I'm going to put some of this down where the sand is as well, and we can kind of change that around and add some lights and darks and things afterwards. But if you just get a basic block in with colour down on here first, where all the sand is. So this is a nice terracotta orangey sort of colour. Looks great on the blue. So blue and orange are complementary colours. They always look lovely together. So if you're ever looking for, you know, a colour blend to focus on in your artwork, then I like to go for complementaries because they're just such a good go-to. And you'll find those on your colour wheel. So your blue will sit opposite your orange. So your complementary colours sit opposite each other on the colour wheel. Okay, so that's enough of that down on there. What I want to do in the trees or up here in the hills is just rub all this in first. So let's just push all of this pigment into the paper. And we can put the greenery on over the top of that. So if you feel like you've got too much of this colour, don't stress. We're coming back in with some trees and greenery. This is just the base coat. This is the dirt that's underneath everything. While I'm here, I'm going to do the same thing and just push all this sand in as well. And again, notice the texture and the movement of the sand. So again, that if you use lovely big flat movements with your fingers as you pull it across the page, then that's going to give it a nice smooth kind of feeling. It's very bright, this colour. Just notice too, there's quite a bit of orange, or it's a muddy kind of colour over here where the sand is wet. So remember, we can see the sand through the water, so there's got to be some of that colour in there as well to match the sand. I'm just going to pop a bit of that in there for now. We'll fill that up with more pigment later. Okay, so notice all my edges are quite blurry and I'm sort of overlapping my colours. So that means that I'm kind of closing the gap between all the different colours, so that when we do start working on the detail, you've already filled in all the underparts. So it's nice because you don't have to worry about it afterwards. It's like putting sky in first and then trees on top. It's getting that base coat down, basically, and that's what we've done. We've just put a base coat down for now. Okay, so focusing back on this little hill here and our trees and greenery and bits and bobs, I can see there's a bit of brown. I don't know if you picked up a brown pastel or not, but remember earlier I said there's some shadow going on through there. So a few little dark marks like this. Just put a few smudges of dark brown or a dark colour in there. That's just going to create a nice little underpainting of shadow and give us a bit of texture and shadow in through those trees. So see, I've just kept my mark quite loose, and I'm just, smooshing a little bit of colour down on there. I don't want to fill it all up. I just want to add a bit of colour like that. So it's starting to look a little bit like trees. The other thing I've noticed, I've got my lighter orange here. So this is a kind of an apricot-y colour. There's a fair bit of light across here. So if you look at the base of that hill, can you see that all the sand or the dirt across the bottom of it there is a bit lighter than the sand itself? So we need to lighten that up. And you'll see that if you look at your black and white picture as well. It should be lighter in tone. Let me check. Yes, it is. So just put it there to show you. You can see at the base of the hill there on the black and white version that it's a lighter grey. So that's always a good thing to refer to. If you're wondering, oh, is that a light orange or what is that, in comparison to the other oranges, I can look at my grey picture and see that it is a lighter tone. There's also a little bit of light on that sand up towards the top left here, and that's maybe water or I don't know, different texture of sand. So noticing that stuff is really important, and putting it in underneath everything now, because we're building the dirt and the foundation under everything. So once you've got some of that onto your little hill, then just start to I'm just going to push it in lightly. So I don't want to blend it because I still want the bright or light colours and the browns to stay separate sort of from everything else. So what I'm doing is just dabbing it with my fingers, and that's going to create a nice natural sort of blend. So there's different motions and movements you can do to create different effects. And so by softening all of that off with my fingers and just dabbing it in, then I can build up on top of it again and get more detail in. So I'm just going to sweep these little bits of colour across, and you'll notice I'm pressing much lighter there so that these light sections sort of stay glowing, I guess, on top of the sand. If I push it in, then it just all gets a bit blurry and muddy. So working with pastels, you've got to sort of determine when to push hard and when not to, and how much to blend, how much do you push it around, or do you just let it sit on the surface? Now I can see a few little tree branches in here. So what I'm going to do is pick up my brown pastel again. I'm just going to use the edge of it to get just a few little trunks, tree trunks and branches. So that's just some random little lines like this, because what we're going to do next is put greens over the top. So these little branches will be sitting underneath or behind some of that foliage. And it just starts to indicate, that there are trees there and shrubs and things that have all these shapes on them. So just a few light lines, nothing in too much detail. So I keep it fairly loose. So you can see already how those colours are starting to create tone and shadow. So where I've put all the light areas is where the sun's probably catching on the dirt or the earth as it goes up in an angle, And then where it's dark is probably where there's shadow or dirt, and also the little under shadows of the trees and things. So let's pop some green on here. I've got this darker green. I've got a couple of greens. So this is a darker green, and I'm just going to literally dot that around. What I'm doing is I'm using the side and the end of it. So I'm trying to vary my mark a little bit and try to keep it a little bit random, so that some of my marks are more heavy than others. And that's what nature does, isn't it? That's what trees do. They have a nice variation of foliage, especially these ones, because they're all beachy kind of trees. They always look a bit scraggly. So just doing that kind of movement with those. Do a few little loose dots up into the sky so that you're creating a bit of foliage, and you can see some sky through the tops of the trees there. And then as we come out onto the headland, it's actually a little bit darker, that green, but I'm going to use this one for now. I can darken it up if I need to, and just put a bit of green across there. Like that. And don't forget that tree branch that sits up on the left of our page too. So you'll see we can do a few little, if you want to. You don't have to do this. If you want to leave it off, you can. It's your painting. So that's the nice thing about doing your paintings, is you can actually choose what you want to put in there. So I feel like I need to add a bit more dark into these trees again. So I'm going to come back with my dark brown and just smush that around a little bit, just to create a bit more shadow. And to get these random smushy kind of marks, I kind of move the pastel around as well and use different parts of it. So you can use ends, the edges, tips, and just imagine it's a paintbrush. You know, when you're using, if you've done painting before, you use paintbrushes in different ways. So if it's a big wide paintbrush, you might use the flat end to do a big wide mark, or you could use the edge of it like a knife to get a line. And pastels work much the same way. It's just learning how to kind of move them around and manipulate them a little bit to get the effect that you're after. And I don't want to spend a whole chunk of time, you know, on these trees. If you wanted to later on, you could come back and refine them a little bit. So we'll finish up on those in a second. Just want to pop a bit, this little bit of light green that I grabbed. So that'll be where the sun's catching on the leaves. Put a little bit of that in there just for some variation and difference in tone. And of course, as you know, the closer something is to us, the more detail we can see. So if it's further away, like that little headland is, there's not going to be as much detail or information because we can't see it that clearly. I'll just put a bit of brown up into these branches here too, just for a bit of variation. And so that's probably just about all we need to do for the trees. I do want to lighten up just here in the front of the trees a little bit more, just to differentiate between there and the sand. I think that will make a nice, you know, kind of border between the two. And just note where there's a few light sections in the sand as well. You might want to put a bit of light in there too, and then we'll get stuck into this sand and water. I love the texture of this paper because as I'm rubbing that lighter pastel over the paper, it's starting to look kind of gritty like sand does, which is nice. So I've got a few light areas in there. Now they're too bright at the moment, those ones in the sand. I quite like the ones below the trees, and I'm going to leave those there. Although I do want to just quickly pop in some, remember those little angular lines we did in the charcoal that created shadow? Do a few of those in there. And that will then give us the impression that this is all on a little hill and the direction that it's going in. So it will just kind of help to create that feeling of the shape of the earth, really. There we go. Lovely. Once we've done that, then we can pick up your terracotta or your sand colour again, and we're going to put more of that down on the paper now. So I'm going to get this nice and rich and lovely. Okay, so if you end up going over something you did earlier, that's okay, because we can always redo it. The nice thing about pastels is you can do that. It's very forgiving. So that's why I love pastels. I can undo stuff a lot, or just go over it, or touch it up again, or just do things again and again until you get it right. So there's a lot of forgiveness in pastels, especially when you're doing this blending technique. So I've just popped a bit more of my terracotta over my sand again because I want to make it nice and thick. And now I'm going to clean my finger off and start to rub that in again. So I'll get it nice and rich and thick. And then we can, again, if you want to add any highlights or lights, you can pop that in afterwards. It's always good to get these block colours down first, and then you've got something to work with. So start loose and then tighten up as you build up your layers and your detail. By putting a bit of a light pastel on here earlier and then rubbing the darker over again, we're still retaining that slightly lighter effect without it being too obvious. And that's what I'm trying to achieve here. It's just a very, very subtle change in the light or the colour of the sand, because it has to change colour. Some of it's kind of got bumps, and it might be slightly on a slight hill or facing away in a different direction. So if the sun's catching a mound or a shape of the sand, then it's going to be a tad lighter on this bottom sort of right hand side, because the light's coming from over our right hand shoulder. So see how I've just created a very subtle difference in the range of oranges through there. And remember, we put a bit of light back up in this left hand corner before. I'm going to pop a bit of that back in again because I did blend it in and kind of lost it. So I'm going to put a little bit back in and then softly blend it just a tiny bit. So I still want to retain some of that brightness there in that sand. I think it must be wet. I'm not sure. Hard to tell on the picture. It's a bit blurred. Doesn't matter. Just paint what you see and it'll all make sense, hopefully. All right. And so over here, I can see there's a little bit of lighter. So you can kind of just now kind of work around the sand and look at where it's lighter and darker and start getting some of the shapes or the textures in there. So over here, I can see there's a slightly higher little mound of sand, and then it drops back behind to a darker section. So just noticing little things like that will start to give your sand and your beach a little bit more body and texture. It's all about the lights and the darks. Just kind of tracing my way around the edges, and you can see I'm kind of blurring into where the water will be, because I know I can come back afterwards and put the water over the edge of this and kind of close the gap a bit. So don't worry if you feel like you're moving too far into the water, because we can come back with the blues and the whites and sharpen that up afterwards. I'm literally I've got the lighter terracotta colour or apricot colour in my hand, and I'm just kind of putting it here and there and then blending it in. try and create just a little bit of variation in the colour of the sand. Just makes it more interesting, I think, when you have a bit of variation. If it's all the one flat, boring colour, then it's boring. Now, when you want to get a bit of shadow in there, I did pick up blue, but no, I think purple is going to be a better option. So purple is always a good option when we want shadows. And around where this sand is wet, see where the wet sand kind of meets the dry sand? We've got that dark kind of ring of colour. To me, that looks purplish, so I'm going to put purple on there. So I'm actually just putting it on quite lightly. I'm not drawing a hard line with the end of my pastel. I'm just kind of dabbing it on gently, gently, because what I'm going to do then is push it in and kind of blur it a little bit. And stick a bit of it too here in the front where the shadow is there too. That's where we put that dark blue before. And I'm going to pop a bit of purple up in amongst my trees, because that'll create some shadow as well. And then if you want to make the sand slightly darker or look a little bit wetter, then your purple will do that, because once we push it into the orange, it'll make this beautiful muddy, lovely colour. So I've got some of that on there now, and once you finish pushing that in, then you can start to blend it in with your fingers. So I'm still pulling it in the direction of the sand. So notice every time I'm putting anything into the sand, I'm running in a horizontal direction, because that's the way all of this land is lying, basically. So you want to kind of try to move your fingers in the direction of whatever it is you're painting. So that's that lovely shadow kind of colour around the outline of the wet sand. I'm just going to pop a bit more of the orange over the top here now. So it's starting to look quite wet, which is what we want. That's good. Nice, these lovely muddy, beautiful colours. All right, I'm going to pop a bit more I'm just back in the wet water over here. And get some of my sand down underneath there before I pop purple and blue on, because again, I want that to look like nice wet sand. Pop a bit of my terracotta-y colour in there. And again, pulling it across, fingers are going to be very sore later on. A lot of rubbing. When you're rubbing on this sort of paper, they do get quite sore after a while. It's like rubbing on sandpaper. If you don't want to use your fingers to do this kind of thing, there's always blenders. So you can get those rubber-tipped blenders, which are really helpful. I find them good for blending into small areas. So this is one of a set of 6. I'm about to show you. They have different ends on them. And so when you want to get into the pointy bits, for example, you know, if you wanted to get into the headland or that little bit of water around the edge there that you can't quite get into because your fingers might be too chunky, then blenders like these are really helpful, because you can actually use them like a finger. They're rubbery, so they've got that nice rubbery kind of texture on the end, and you can get into the pointy bits to push all your pastel in. And it just means that that way you can do a bit more fine work rather than just using your fingers. Of course, the other way to do it is just, you know, grab your pastels itself and use that to create the harder lines or the more defined lines. And the other thing that really helps is pastel pencils. So if you can get your hands on some pencils, if you haven't got any already, they're really good too for getting the detail. Drawing in things like hairs and eyelashes and fur and stuff like that. Okay, so we've got, let's say we've got the sand pretty much sorted out. And we'll start working on this wet area here. So as I said, I'm still working in layers. So this wet area in the front here sits under the waves, right? because the waves are kind of lapping over the top of this area. So I want to get this wet section done first, and then we can focus on the waves and the foam and the white bits in the water. Okay, so as I said earlier, I feel like there's a lot of blue in this area around the edge of this wet section, and that's because it's reflecting the sky. Okay, so it's got this beautiful shine going on. So I'm using my light blue that I had on the sky to get this in here. I'm just going to put a bit of colour down and then do the same thing and blend all of that in again. And you'll find it'll go muddy because we've got the orange there underneath it. And I'm going to, before I do that, I want to get just blocking in again. So blocking in a bit of my purple here. I can see purple in there. And I might even need to go grab a bit of pink or red, I think. There's definitely some red in there, isn't there? And around the edge of the wet sand, just a little bit of red. It's more of a deep red, like a dark red. So I'll see what that looks like anyway. If it doesn't work, I can go over it. I just feel like that needs to have a bit of red in there, a bit more warmth around the edges here. So this is what happens when you know, in the middle of a painting and you'll see a colour that you didn't see before. And that's when you go and grab it out of your collection and add it to your palette. So always keep your palette separate from your main collection of pastels. When I'm working on something, I just have a separate little palette of colours so I know what I'm using, and I'll remember if I come back next week, it's all still sitting there ready to go. Okay, so I'm just going to push all of this in and see what happens. Obviously, we're mixing colour on the paper and not on a palette or anywhere. So sometimes you get a lovely surprise and sometimes you get a terrible shock, depending on what colours you've put down and what's underneath already and all that kind of thing. But I think that's the most exciting part about all of this. I really enjoy seeing what happens when I mix the colours together. So you can see there, it's starting to get a little bit muddy and a little bit kind of dirty, and that's good. That's what we want. You just really got to study the colours to figure out what needs to happen and what you need to maybe add or take away. So I'm just going to tip off some of this dust. And then look at the colours and see what needs to happen. So I feel like there needs to be a bit more blue, or like the sky blue in there. It's gone a bit kind of green now. So let's start with the outside area of where the wet section is. I'm going to put a bit more purple around there. Just want to darken that off a little bit more, just to get the rim of the wet sand a little bit more defined. And then push that in. And what I'm doing when I push that in, I'm taking it from the outside of the wet area towards the water. So trying to create sort of a bit of an edge, I guess, between that and the wet area. Because we want it to look like it's wet, but not full of water. Okay, and then I want to add this blue. So this is the darker blue that we used in the sky in the first place. I just want to see if that's going to be blue enough. Because as I said earlier, it's reflecting the sky. And again, I'm just using this pastel on its side because I don't want to have a hard line. You'll notice if you use the ends of your pastels, you get a hard mark or a really hard line. But if you use the sides, you'll get a much softer coverage. Now I feel that's still a bit too dark, so I can add this lighter blue into a couple of spots. So what I'm doing is looking at where the light is in here. It's kind of around the edge of the wet area. So I'm putting a bit of lighter blue over the top of the darker blue. I haven't blended those yet. So kind of just waiting to see what happens. I'm going to put a bit more purple in the darker sections. So see this sort of darker wet area just before it meets the waves is a little darker through there. And then adding a little bit of my terracotta orangey sand colour over the top of that, just to get a bit more mud in there. Okay. Now I think I'm ready to start to blend some of this in again. So I'm going to clean off my finger. Might try another finger if it's not hurting quite so much. And start to push this in. Again, pulling it horizontally. Yeah, because that's the way the water's moving, isn't it? It's kind of moving across the water, sand. So we want to pull it in that horizontal direction. And then pulling again where I've got the purple and the terracotta, that darker kind of tone through there. Trying to create this shiny, wet look. So you'll find as you do this kind of thing, you'll have to kind of go over it a few times and vary the way that you blend, how hard you press, and whether you choose to leave some of the colour sitting on the surface or if you want to push it in a little bit harder. So I still feel like that's not quite light enough. So I'm going to try, I've got my, I think this is Australian grey, so it's a very light, creamy colour. Let's see if that might help to lighten this up a little bit. I know it's very blue. I might add a bit more light blue over the top of it. See how you just kind of keep trying different things until you get the right tone and colour. I've got a lot of dust sitting there on my paper too, so that's probably not helping much to see the edges of things. And then I'm going to pop a bit of my light blue over the top of that. So if you're ever trying to find a colour that's lighter or to lighten something up, put, you know, a cream or a white underneath your colour and then add the colour you want over the top again. And you'll find usually that will help to lighten it up for you. And then once you've got that down, then again, you just want to gently, gently push it in. And make sure you're pulling it horizontally in the direction the water's flowing. Because we want to get that kind of movement in it, of the water moving out from the beach back to the ocean. And then, you know, I'm going to come back with more purple. So we're just going to keep kind of working this to get it to the right tones. And you can just add a little bit at a time, push it in and push it around, and then see what you think. See how it looks. And remember to tip your dust off in between your sections too. Still not the right blue. Still not quite there. Add a bit. See, I want to darken off around the edges of that again because I've lost my darks where the darkest water is. I'm using a little bit of the red now, just to darken that off. If you want something to get lighter, often it helps to put dark next to it. So you know how sometimes you think, oh, I can't get there's any whiter or lighter. Try putting a darker tone around it or behind it or next to it, and it'll bring the lights up. It's amazing how that works. So the red is nice. It's the same kind of tones as the orange in the sand. It's a warm, lovely warm tone. Obviously it's the base for orange because orange is made of red and yellow. So I've got lots of lovely red tones in there already. I feel like I've got to find another blue to put on here just to get the light. So I'm just gently pulling that out to soften off that edge. I'm going to try a bit of that brown actually. I feel like I want something darker around the border there. See, sometimes you just got to try colours until you get the right one. It's all a little bit of trial and error, and it's exactly like mixing paint on a palette, only you're doing it on your painting, which can be a little bit intimidating sometimes because you think, oh my goodness, do I really want to add that? And we do get scared. But at the end of the day, it's just a bit of paper. So better not to stress over it too much. Now I'm going to come back in with my light blue again. See if I can. I think I'm going to have to get a very light purple. Maybe that'd be better. Can't quite find the right colour for this. It's all about mixing, isn't it? Unless you've got one in your box ready to go. It's about just mixing the colours around until you get the right blend. All right, I'm going to find, it's definitely blue though. Maybe I need some of this blue. That's the blue I used in the ocean, in the dark blue. Yeah, maybe that's better. That's looking better. It's kind of tying in now with the rest of the water. Yeah. Okay, now we're in business. See how it takes a little while sometimes just to kind of find the right colours to make the tones that you're after. So it's all about the tone again, isn't it? And again, if you are in doubt, look at the black and white picture. Always have a black and white version of whatever you're doing if you can, because it really does help. So I'm going to have a quick look at the tone. Yeah, so the tone of the light in that water is actually not as light as the sky. The light section of the sky, it's darker. So I was trying to make it brighter, but that doesn't work. It's got to be darker. So that's when, yeah, noticing that stuff really makes a difference to the choices that you make as far as your colours and things go. I'm just using this dark brown a little bit too because it's got that beautiful warm red base plus the orange base, and it's giving me a really nice depth throughout this area here. Lovely jubbly. Okay, tip off some dust and then we'll get stuck into these waves and the water. Now that will probably need a bit more work. And like I was saying before, blenders are great. You know, if you just want to tidy up a few edges, like this, for instance, around where the wet water edge is, I can grab a little blender and just sort of push this around a little bit, and you get a bit more detail in there because it's not a big fat chunky finger. What that's doing is picking up a lot of dust and leaving it on the page, but that's okay, I can tip that off. Lovely. All right. I'll just tip off my dust and then we can start to look at the water. So I'm looking at the water from the back and we're going to come forward. So let's start off in the horizon, which is quite dark. We've already put down one coat or layer of pastel on there. So let's pop a little bit more on so that then we can add a few little highlights to that horizon. So what I want to do is just get my darker blue, which is the first one we used for the water back here, and just pop that on again. And kind of get a bit more pigment into the tooth. And then I'm just going to push that in so we've got a nice base to start with. And again, you might feel like you need to use a blender or something a little bit pointy to get into that area up near the headland because it's quite small up there. It's a bit harder to reach. So I've created quite a bit of dust. I'm going to leave that there for now. What I want to do is get a little bit of my blue. So this is my darker blue that I used in the sky. And I'm going to pop a bit of that just in horizontal little shapes across the water here. Because see how at the back there we've got quite a lot of reflection or light on the water. It's moving, it's always moving. And so the wind is moving the water, and as that's happening, the higher pieces or bits of water, the little waves, are catching the light. And so there's got to be, you know, a range of tones in blues back there. And they kind of all go horizontal. So if you run your pastel just very lightly, what I've got to do, I've got it on its side, and I'm just kind of pulling it across and pressing a little bit hard and then lifting off so that I'm trying to make those sort of random distant wave look without being too refined or defined. So that'll probably do for that section. I'm just going to tip off that dust because that's going to annoy me. Okay. And then I picked up this bluey green ocean sort of colour as well. So I'm going to put a bit of that in there too because it's just lovely and it's nice and I like it. If you don't have anything that you can use that you'd like, then don't worry about it. I just like having a little bit of variation in those blues, make it a little bit more oceany with that greeny colour. Okay, now you'll notice at the front here, so I'm going to pick up my pale blue that I used in my sky. Check my black and white picture to make sure about the tones. Squint if you need to. Yep. So see this water here between the wet water and the dark water. So it's where all the foam is. What I'm going to do is use my pale blue to put some of that in there and just go lightly. Be careful, you don't want to lose all that lovely wet sand we just made. where we've got waves or little white foam areas, we can come back over those with white and brighten those up. So let's just fill in some of this light area that's running across the front here. And of course it's not all a straight line, so just be aware of the shape of that. And use your light blue to kind of draw in that shape, so that it sort of comes across and sits on top of this wet sand. And you can see, as I'm doing that, you can see the little waves rolling in up the back there. So I'm just going to use my little light blue again, run it light down on its side, and then run it across the water. So we're creating these little wave kind of shapes in the distance. They're those little distant ones. And remember, we can always lighten these up. So when we're doing things like this, I don't like to use white from the beginning, because that way I can then come back over these things with white and get my brights really nice and bright. So even though the light blue will look like it's white or really light now compared to your other colours, once we put the white over the top of it, that's when it's really going to sparkle. So we're just building the foundation at the moment for these light wave areas, and see how that's all starting to now look like there's some movement in the water and waves coming up onto the beach. That's what we want to achieve. Okay, so just using that lovely light blue pastel to do that. And I don't know if you've noticed, but there's a bit of shadow coming off these little foam areas onto that wet sand. So what can we use in the shadow? Let me have a look at my tones again. It's quite dark. And I'll look at the grey version. So maybe we can use, what have I used that's dark? I'm going to go for this. Is brown too? No, don't do brown. Maybe purple. I might need a darker purple actually, but I'm going to try a bit of purple in here just for some of the shadow. No, it won't be dark enough. Definitely not dark enough. I'm going to try a bit of charcoal actually, because charcoal's soft. It's not quite black, so it's not too dark, and I can control a thin stick of it to create a little bit of shadow. So see, there's shadow just here under these little waves. I'm just using my charcoal. Sometimes charcoal kind of doesn't stick too well, but it's a good option if you just want a soft mark and something a little darker without reverting to black. So that kind of works, I think. And you can get quite a fine line with charcoal as well. And then if you feel like you've lost some of your lights, you can just pop back in with your pale blue and put a bit more light back in, or cover up some of that dark so that you haven't got as much dark. So you're kind of dancing between the two. And see how by applying that light blue over the darker blue, it's starting to create that nice feeling of waves. And I can see underneath the foam, you know, the other colours of the water or the sand. And so that's what we want to achieve. And pastels are beautiful for that, because you just literally just got to touch them on the paper and lift them up, and you get this beautiful transparency effect with them. And you can see all the colours underneath. It's quite amazing. So you don't want to overdo it with your light blue. You don't want to fill that up too much, because we're going to come back in and put a bit of white on there, here and there, to give it some highlights. So that might do for that bit now. And then we want to come down and do this section down in here too. So see it down here on the bottom right, we've got this wave that sort of comes in about here, and then down and across. So that's this shape here. So I've just drawn that in with my light blue pastel. Just use the end of my pastel as if it's a pencil and just drawn that in to get the shape of that section here in the foreground. And what I'm going to do is just put my light blue pastel in there, smush that around and pretty much block in that area with this colour. I think I've brought this little wave a bit too far forward, but I might get away with it. Maybe. If not, so see how I've come, I'll show you, I've come too far across here. So I didn't check my grid and I didn't check my drawing. What I want to do is get rid of that now. And because it's on top of this water, all I have to do is just kind of push it through. See, because I've already worked on the water underneath. I might need to touch it up a little bit, add a bit more dark and muck around with that, tad more. So I will, I'll pop a bit more dark in there and under here. So a bit of brown, just tidying this up. So see how it's so easy to undo something or go over it and redo it until you get it the way you want it to be. So now I've got rid of that little bit of extra wave that I made too big. And once I've tipped off some of my dust again, I can come back and draw that back in where it actually should be, which is not quite so far in as I had it. So to about there, like that. And so you can very quickly and easily undo things if you get them in the wrong spot. Okay, so we'll fill all this part in with some of the light blue. Now you can see underneath on the sand here, we've got some of the sandy colour showing through under here in the foreground. I want to get some of that orange or terracotta colour onto there as well. I'm going to add my dark blue onto that because see it's quite dark under that white foam. It's a very dark sort of orange or earthy kind of colour. Now if I mix my orange and blue together, they're going to make a nice muddy sort of colour. Kind of went green, but never mind. And I'm just going to lightly push all of this in, and then I can come back over that again with my light blue to get my light foam back in there. But what I hadn't done before was put any darks underneath, and I'll need to darken up. You know why? If we don't darken up under here, then when we put the light on, it won't be light enough. So you need the dark to make the light shine. So to get it to really glow and shine in the light and feel like the sun's, you know, bouncing off those waves, which is what's happening in this foreground wave, then we really need to make sure we've got enough dark underneath it so that the light will pop on top. Yeah? Is that going to be dark enough? I'm just squinting now to see. Yeah, probably. I feel like I want to put some of that up under here. Remember I put a bit of shadow up under here with charcoal before, but I feel like I want to make it more, I don't know, brown. Some of these waves, so I'm just kind of going back a little bit now. As we get towards the end of the painting, you start to kind of jump around a little bit and want to change the detail in some of it as you go, and that's perfectly fine. That's what we do. Yeah, that's better. So I've just softened off that shadow a little bit, popped a bit of purple into those waves there to create a bit of shadow underneath those. And when I pop white on the top, I might show you actually. So just in here, I put a bit of purple because I wanted to create shadow. And then when I put my white on, this is a very dry white, I'll have to go and find another creamy one. See how that just pops against that purple because it's creating a shadow, and then we've got the shine on the top. It's creating a bit of dust there, but you can see how that might look once I get a proper white. This is not creamy enough. If the schminky whites are amazing for this, especially if you just do a little bit on the surface and then leave it. Your schminky pastels are lovely and creamy, so they're great for touching things up right at the end. Or if you're not going to blend, they're really good pastels. But if you're a blender, you'll find you'll fill up your paper and your tube very quickly with the schminky. But they are gorgeous for doing the whites like this on your waves. So if you only ever can afford one schminky, they're about $9 each. Make sure you get a white one. So can you see there how the white is really shining now against that pale blue? So it's actually much whiter. What we want to be very careful of is when we do put the white on, is to not do too much, because that way it kind of loses its impact. So we really need to be very careful about where you put your white, and don't overdo it. Just selectively put it in a couple of places so that you just get that lovely highlight, and everything else is not quite so bright. Anyway, before we jump into white, let's get back over into this section here. I think I've got it dark enough underneath there now. So I'm just going to come back in with my pale blue and put a bit more of that on top. I can just wipe it lightly like this. And if you just wipe it lightly, the texture of the paper is really going to help us create the texture of these beautiful little waves, because we can kind of see through them. It's kind of got this funny bumpy texture, I guess. And so the paper contributes to that, which is really nice. I like how that's working out. I really like the combination of the brown and the blue under there. It's a nice kind of oceany colour, isn't it? Lovely. All right. So just putting down a bit more of this. So now we're getting to the point where we do not want to blend too much. Can you see around the edge of this wave in the foreground here? It's quite thick and white or bright. So I'm going to just put a bit more of my blue, light blue on there, and just use the pastel to kind of blend itself around, and try not to get my fingers in there, because once you get your fingers into something, it turns a bit muddy, which is awesome for our undercoats and our sand and the water in those areas, because we wanted to get that effect. But now that we're working up towards the detail and wanting to get like a much thicker kind of color to sit on the top, this is when you want to stop blending and just get the pastels to work on their own. And depending again on the kind of pastels you've got, so if they're lovely and creamy, you'll get a really nice thick coverage. If they're a bit drier, you might need to try and add a few layers. So it just depends on the pastels you've got and the paper you've got. Different paper has different texture as well, so you might not be getting this kind of dotty effect. If you're on like a Métience paper or a Canson one, then you'll find you might get more like a chicken wire sort of pattern, and that can work beautifully too. All right, so what I've done now is just tried to sort of lighten up all that bright foam that's going on here in the foreground. And remember, we've got that really dark shadow there in front under the wave. Now, what I've got isn't dark enough. I want to make that really dark so that my light pops against it. So when I put a bit of white in there, it's really going to sing. So I've got my blue violet here. So this is one of the darkest pastels, and I really like this color because it's just such a lovely color for shadow, and it's warmer than black, and just always gives me a really nice kind of finish. So I'm going to try and use the tip or the edge of this to get a bit of a fine line around here where that shadow sits. And because it's such a strong color, I'm just going to go quite lightly. I don't want to press too hard, because it's a bugger to get off if you want to remove it afterwards. So when you're using this color or any darks, just try to go kind of lightly first before you commit. So tread lightly, and then if you're happy with how it looks and what it does, then, you know, by all means add more, or you know, refine it, or whatever you need to do. But it's, yeah, it's really hard to get off if you ever want to remove it. Okay, so that's looking nice. I'm just going to put a little bit of this dark down in through here, just a few dots in through here, because I want to create some shadows in there in the foreground of the wave, and that'll kind of tie it all in nicely. Alternatively, if you have pencils, you might prefer to use those to get these finer lines happening. I'm just too lazy to go and get them out of the box, that's all. And I'm going to pop a bit of this dark. So now I've picked up the dark, I want to keep putting it in spots. There's a little bit of shadow in the water over here. So I'm just going to pop a bit of that through there just to create a little bit more depth in the water. And I can also pop a little bit of it up in amongst those trees, just to kind of tie everything together a little bit and create a nice range of lights and darks. So you don't have to put it in too many places. It's just nice to create that lovely range of tone, and helps to find the sunshine. So, you know, whatever is dark will be in shadow, and then the dark color brings out the lights. So don't be afraid of the dark. I had a lady in class the other day, and she said, I've always been afraid of putting too much dark on. I said, no, dark is what makes the drama in your art. It's what makes it pop. It's what gives it, you know, an appeal. So don't be afraid to use darks. Just go gently is all I can say. Just go lightly and gently, and then once you're happy, then you can kind of push a bit harder or add a bit more. Okay, so I've got this nice dark shadow going on down through here. What I'm going to do is just soften that off a tiny little bit with my blender. Okay, because I just want to try and get the edge to be a little bit more precise through here. And my finger's going to be far too chunky to do that without blurring it and smudging it. So the blender works nicely just to push the pastel into the paper, get it to hold on, and soften it off just a little bit. Okay, and then of course tipping off some dust if you've got too much going on. Try not to blow it. And I've got those little dark spots on the water there, so I'm just going to dab them in gently just to soften those off a little bit. So there's all these different movements, I guess, you can do to change the way things look, whether it's dabbing or pushing it around and blending. There's so many ways you can move your fingers around to create different effects. Okay, so now what we want to do is just going to look at this little shadow that's on the side here. I don't know what it's of, or if it's, you might not want to put that in, I don't know. It kind of doesn't, it's not anything unless there's some sort of a tree or person or something there in the sun. But anyway, you can pop that in if you want to, just on that bottom right hand corner. I don't know if you can see it there in the water. It's like a blue shadow. I'm trying purple. The blue didn't quite work, it wasn't quite dark enough. Not sure what that is, but anyway, I'm coming back in now with a bit more of my pale blue. So that's the one I did all this light waves and work with. Don't forget, we've still got white up our sleeve. This is why I like to save my white for last, because I know I can come back with my white and really get my lights to sing. And that's actually the most exciting part when you get to the end and you can add your whites. And it just all starts to pop. It's really fun. Okay, so we'll tip off some dust and then pop a bit of white on. I just spotted a bit more shadow over here. So again, remembering the direction the sun is in and why that's going to be causing shadow in these little waves, because these waves they're like a solid object almost. I mean, I know they're not, but they do create shadow because they're lumpy, for want of a better word. So you might want to just tidy up a few spots here and there. It's easy to smudge things and get colours blended in together where you didn't mean to. So just by softening off that little purple shadow, it's just made it a little bit more gentle. I'll just soften off this one here too in the foreground. I know it's really dark in the picture, but it's kind of a bit much, I think. I don't know. I might just touch up some of the sand on the edge of that there. And gently push that in. Alrighty, so tip off some dust and then I'm going to go get a white schminky pastel because it's so creamy and gorgeous and perfect for waves because it sits on the surface and shines. You can feel the difference with the schminkies, so they feel much creamier. They're very soft and buttery, whereas your other pastels might be feeling a little more dry and crumbly. So it doesn't really look much different, but it just comes off on your fingers really easily and has a really lovely texture. So when you buy your pastels, you'll end up taking all the labels off and then you can't remember what's what, which is what I've done. So I go by feel most of the time. So let's have a look at this picture now. What we want to do is find all the really white, bright white parts. So if I look, I'm going to start at the back and just notice the little waves that are coming up onto the beach over here and start to put just a few spots in. So you, like I said before, you don't want to overdo it. You just want to go very gently and put in a few here and there, because the good thing is if it's not enough, you can come back and put on more after. And when you're doing it with, especially with a creamy one like this, you just want to dab it and push and then lift up. Don't try to blend, because what will happen is it'll just mix up with whatever's underneath it and become a little bit muted and lose its brightness. So I'm just going to work forward from the back, and again just be very selective about where you put your white, because you really don't want to put too much down and take away from the brightness of it all. So I'm just coming forward now around this, all these little waves here in the middle area that are sort of lapping onto the wet sand there. And so I can push this down and get some really nice white going on. Just moving back over there, just checking what I've done, touching up things as we go. So see how that white's just really catching the light now. It's just gorgeous, bright. And you can do little splashy movements with this, so you can kind of dab it and dot it and create, all these different shapes that will give you different outcomes or different effects with the waves. Because some are splashing, some are folding over. They have all these different shapes. And then as you get closer to the foreground, so I'm still over here on the halfway line, putting a few light bits in there. And it really does heighten or brighten, highlight all those shiny little bits of foam. Okay, and then I'm coming into the foreground now, so where it's lightest on this big foam area is right on the very edge between the foam and the sand, because the light's catching it right there. So I'm just dotting some of my white around the edges there. And because it's kind of below us from where we're standing, then the sun's coming from behind. So these little foamy waves are kind of folding over, and that's what's causing the shadow on the sand. So you might find, I'm finding with the schminke, because it is so creamy, it tends not to stick sometimes. It just doesn't want to stay on the paper. So I've got to use a little bit of pressure and push it in and kind of just let the pigment sit on the surface there. So different pastels behave in different ways, depending on paper and brand and texture and colour and all those things. I like how that's starting to really glow now and look like it's got, you know, all this beautiful sunshine bouncing off it. Just got to clean up this edge where I've got shadow and then I ran over it. There's a lot of dust sitting on there too, so it's hard to see the complete edge of it. I'm just going to use a bit of charcoal actually to sharpen up that shadow on this bit. And then just over here on the right hand side, I'm going to pop a bit of charcoal in there too, just to get some shadow under there. Don't be afraid to use other mediums with your pastels as well. So, you know, for instance, if you wanted to fill a sky in like we did earlier, and you don't want to wear your fingers out, you can always do a watercolor wash underneath. So if you have a white or light colored paper, then, you know, you can always use watercolor to paint your background on, let it dry, and then pop your pastel over the top, or let that become your background. So you can definitely mix other media with pastels. And these papers, these Colour Fix papers, are really lovely because they will take some water. So they're pretty robust. And if you wanted to do that, then that's always a great option. And it's fun too, just to experiment with different things and see what happens. Alrighty, so I think we're nearly there. Just got to get some of that dust off my page and maybe add a bit more shine down through here. What I'm doing now is just, still got my white schminke in my hand. I'm just kind of smushing it around a little bit to try and get some of that white to stick to the paper. I don't want to cover the whole thing because I really like the mottly kind of colours that are showing through here, and that the foam is not quite as thick there, so you've got that lovely darker feeling underneath it. But as I said, you know, you don't want to overdo it either, because then it takes away from the really bright highlights. Just going to dab that a little bit, soften it off. Oh, lovely. I think we're just about there. Just sitting now and checking my painting against my picture. If you are sitting down and you can't see what you've done from a distance, it's always a good idea to stand up and step back. And then you can see it from another perspective, because when you're sitting close to something all the time, you tend to kind of lose perspective and you can't really see what you're doing. Just got to clean up this little edge on the wave here, because I kind of went outside the lines a bit. And this is, again, is where blenders can come in handy too. So you can actually push the pastel around a bit and try to sharpen up some of those edges. I just smudged it, made it worse now. But good thing is you can just always come back with the colour that you had before and touch it up. And as you work towards your final layers, you can blend less and just let the colour sit on the surface. So that's always a really nice option too, is just to have that lovely feeling of the texture over the top. So for instance, on the sand here, I can run this darker orange. So we put a bit of light in there before. If I run that across there now, and because I've got this gorgeous texture in my paper, it's starting to look a bit grainy, and I can see the lighter colour underneath this last layer, but it's still got that nice kind of sandy, gritty look. And so I'm going to leave that there and not blend it in. And if you just do all the detail like that in the foreground, leave the background kind of more blended and smoother, because it's further away, so you can't see all the detail. But on this closer foreground stuff, I can actually have a bit of a play with that and let the detail, you know, let that texture be part of the sand or the detail. It's kind of fun. You get that little bit of a bumpy effect. Okay, so I just need to clean up this bit here. I tried to do it. Went wonky on me. So I've just got my other white now. Clean up that part. And through here. A bit more dust to tip that off again. And we'll be just about done. I'm going to find myself a little black pencil, because I really want to clean up this bit here. And my charcoal didn't quite do it for me. So if I get a bit of a black pencil, pencils are great. Don't underestimate pencils. Just to get this shadow in here. Down through there, and around through there, and across there. So I know that's quite dark, that shadow, but it's dark on the picture, and it kind of didn't jump out and bite me when I looked at that initially. I really liked how that worked, so I think we might just keep it dark. But if you don't like it dark, you can always lighten it off. You could try a bit of purple in there to soften it off a little bit. Purple's always a good option for shadows. See how that just softened it off? Oh, can't see yet because my voice is ahead of my picture. It's a little bit delayed today, the video. So that just softened it off a little bit. So yeah, the only other thing I can see is the direction of the water here kind of is pulling from this direction. So you could technically do a few little, it's hard now because I've got a lot of pastel on here already and it won't kind of let me add too much more. Kind of try and pull it in the direction that the wave's going in. But I'll lose too much of my darks if I keep mucking around with that. And then, as I said, the schminkies is so lovely and creamy, but it's not wanting to stick too much. And this is what happens when you get a lot of pastel on the paper. It tends not to want to stick anymore. And that's when you need to either use a fixative spray, so you can fix it with a spray and then keep adding colour over the top of that, or pastel. And that will help to, let you put more layers down. So it's quite handy. And you can, it's only about $13 for a spray of can of fixative, cheapy one. Just don't use it on your final painting because it dulls the colours too much. It takes out all the brights. But it's really good for in between your layers when you want to get more pastel on the page and set or fix whatever's underneath. So I'm going to stop mucking around with this now, otherwise I'm going to wreck it, because there does come a point when you have to stop. And we might finish up right there. So I hope you've had a great day today. I hope you've really enjoyed this class, and I look forward to seeing your paintings. So don't forget to send them through to me, and have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Oh, final thing, don't forget to sign it. So if you have a bit of charcoal, thin bit of charcoal like this, you can just sign it with that, or a pastel pencil or a charcoal pencil. Either of those will work really nicely. So just pop your name on in a corner somewhere. And if you don't like the way that worked out, you can always just push it all back in and do it again. Rightio. See you next time.